In the early evening of the 16th of June 1940, the Prime Minister of France sat by a telephone in Bordeaux and wrote down, word by word, a document being dictated to him from London. The voice on the line belonged to a French general almost nobody had heard of. The words belonged to the British War Cabinet, and what they proposed was this: that France and Great Britain stop being two separate countries and become one. One union, one war cabinet, commanding every soldier, sailor and airman the two nations possessed. One citizenship from that day forward for everyone from the Highlands to the Mediterranean. Winston Churchill's government had approved the text that afternoon. It was not a gesture, it was a formal offer of political union between Britain and France, made at the most desperate hour either country had ever known. Within 5 hours the offer was dead. The man who received it had resigned, and the government that replaced him asked Germany for terms. This is the story of the Franco-British Union, the single afternoon it lived, and the men who killed it. To understand how such an idea reached a cabinet table, you have to watch France fall at the speed it actually fell. On the 10th of May 1940, the German army attacked in the west. The Netherlands surrendered in 5 days. Belgium lasted 18. The armoured columns did not hit the French line where it was strong. They came through the Ardennes forest, crossed the river Meuse at Sedan, and reached the English Channel 10 days later, cutting the Allied armies in two. The British army escaped through Dunkirk and left its equipment on the sand. On the 5th of June, the Germans turned south. On the 10th, the French government abandoned Paris. On the 14th, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The government fled to Tours, then further still to Bordeaux. A great power 3 centuries old was coming apart in a matter of weeks. And that collapse created a very specific problem in London. In March 1940, Britain and France had promised each other in a joint declaration that neither would seek an armistice or a peace separately. Each was bound to the other. If France asked Hitler for terms, the alliance did not just weaken, it dissolved. And it left one question hanging over everything. What would happen to the French fleet? The French Navy was one of the largest and most modern in the world. At Britain's side, it helped keep Germany off the seas. In German hands, it could open the way to invasion. Every plan London made that June came back sooner or later to those ships. In the middle of all this sat a man with no army, no ministry, and one idea. Jean Monnet was a French businessman who ran the Joint Committee in London, coordinating the two countries' war purchases, and he had spent the war arguing that Britain and France could only survive as a single economic machine. Now, as France buckled, Monnet pushed that logic to its end. If the two countries already fought as one machine, why should they not survive as one state? Working with his deputy René Pleven, with senior British officials including Robert van Sittart, and with the French ambassador in London, Monnet turned the idea into a draft declaration. Not an alliance, not a treaty, a union. One country fighting one war, so that even if French soil was overrun, France itself would fight on, fused with Britain, its empire and its fleet. Churchill's first reaction, by his own account, was unfavourable. He was 3 weeks from Dunkirk, expecting invasion, and in no mood for constitutional experiments. What changed his mind was the arithmetic coming out of Bordeaux, where the French cabinet was sliding hour by hour toward asking for an armistice. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud wanted to fight on, from North Africa if it came to that. Around him, the voices of surrender grew louder by the hour. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun, wanted the fighting stopped. And the army's commander, General Weygand, had already given Reynaud his verdict on Britain. In 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. On the morning of the 16th of June, London tried conditions first. Telegrams went to Bordeaux agreeing to release France from the March Pledge on one condition: that the French fleet sail for British harbours before any armistice talks began. Then, at lunchtime, everything turned. Charles de Gaulle was in London that day, 49 years old, a general for barely a month, a minister for barely a fortnight, sent across to negotiate about shipping. He had seen Monnet's draft, and he believed it was the last card that might keep France in the war. Over lunch, he pressed it on Churchill directly. Something dramatic was needed to arm Reynaud against the men of surrender. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the War Cabinet met. and something remarkable happened. Ministers who had dismissed the idea days earlier now spoke for it, one after another. The telegrams about the fleet were suspended. The draft was polished line by line, and by late afternoon, the British government had formally approved a declaration of union with France. Britain, at the lowest hour in its modern history, had just offered to stop being Britain. The text still reads like a dispatch from another timeline. It opened at this most fateful moment in the history of the modern world and declared an indissoluble union between the two nations. Then came the sentence at its heart. France and Great Britain shall no longer be two nations, but one Franco-British union. Every citizen of France would immediately become a citizen of Great Britain. Every British subject would become a citizen of France. There would be a single war cabinet, joint organs of defense and of finance, and every force both countries possessed placed under one direction. The declaration closed with 5 words, "And thus we shall conquer." At around 4:30, de Gaulle telephoned Bordeaux and dictated the full text to Reynaud, who copied it down by hand. Witnesses described the French Prime Minister transformed. Here, at the last hour, was something to fight with. Churchill then took the phone himself, and the two leaders agreed to meet at sea the next morning to settle the union face to face. That evening, Churchill boarded a special train at Waterloo, bound for a warship on the south coast. With him went the leaders of the other parties and the chiefs of staff. Most of the British government was travelling to a rendezvous with a country it intended to merge with. The train was still at the platform when the news arrived. In Bordeaux, Reynaud carried the declaration into a cabinet meeting that evening, expecting it to change everything. It did, just not in the direction he believed. He read the text to his ministers, and what came back was not debate. It was revulsion. Some ministers saw a British trick to grab France's fleet and its colonies while the country drowned. One said it would be better to become a Nazi province, because at least they knew what that meant. Another warned that union would reduce France to a British dominion. And Marshal Pétain, asked for his view, gave the answer that history remembers. Union with Britain, he said, would be fusion with a corpse. The corpse was Britain. In that room, the hero of Verdun looked at the country that was about to stand alone against Hitler and pronounced it already dead. The declaration was never put to a formal vote. Reynaud, outnumbered and exhausted, resigned that night. President Lebrun sent for Pétain, who had a new government ready within hours. In London, Churchill stepped down from his train and went back to Downing Street. The next day, Pétain went on French radio and told his country the fighting must stop. That same day, a British aircraft carried de Gaulle back to London, and on the 18th of June, he made his own broadcast, calling on France to fight on. 2 speeches, a day apart, that divided France for a generation. On the 22nd of June, France signed an armistice with Germany at Compiègne, in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918. Hitler insisted on the setting personally. 6 days. That is the distance between a British offer of common citizenship and a French armistice with Nazi Germany. There is no way to know whether a Franco-British union could ever have worked, and most historians doubt it. But the story saved one last irony for the end. The junior general who dictated the offer down the phone line, who begged his government to bind France to Britain, became president of France. And when Britain asked, in 1963 and again in 1967, to join the European community that Jean Monnet had helped to build, the answer from President Charles de Gaulle both times was no. One more thing, while the Union was dying in Bordeaux, crates stenciled with the word fish were already crossing the Atlantic, carrying Britain's treasury out of the reach of invasion. That story, the story of Operation Fish, is already on this channel, and if your family carries a memory of that June, from either side of the channel, put it in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people write them down,